ongoing enterprise, our locating and attempting to restore the slave burial ground. It's somewhere right out in the front field. The big yellow house looks out on it somewhere. Between these two things, the fishing at the pond when I was 12 and the finding the burial ground, and my book will be these interviews with over 20 Black people who fish from shore, just like I did at Blackacre. On Saturdays, beginning in 1969, Clifton, a Black man who worked for my grandparents, would take me to and from Blackacre so I could fish. Well, when it was time for him to take me home, he would come to collect me, and I'd give him the bluegill in my bucket, and he would take those to his friends and family downtown. So one day he comes to take me home, he looks in the bucket, it's empty, and he says, "Macauley, where are your fish?" And I said, "I let them go." I didn't like seeing fish suffer, and I still don't. And he cried out in despair and told me that his friends and neighbors depended on my fish. And I don't think it's because they were hungry, but instead I think it's because my fish connected them to their past, their ancestors, their shared culture. Because when you were enslaved, your nutrition was terrible. You were chronically malnourished. The average recorded birth weight of enslaved babies was 5.5 pounds. During slave times, Sunday was a customary day off. And what did they do with that time? They hunted and they fished. 2 reasons. One was nutrition, the other was freedom. Hunting and fishing were probably the only times that the slaves who lived at Blackacre had anything like freedom, which is the heart of what it means to be an American. I've always liked being with Black people. I can't explain why. And I wanted to know more about the people Clifton gave my fish to. People whose ancestors, it turns out, might even have been owned right at Blackacre by your ancestors. And for the record, at least 4 of my ancestors on my father's side owned and trafficked human beings. As a child, I used to wander Blackacre a lot, and it was paradise. Around the time Clifton despaired of my empty bucket, I went exploring one day out in the front field. I happened upon a burial ground, a graveyard. Even as a little kid, I knew that this was a graveyard. It had smallish stones on the ground, and they were clearly to mark graves, but there were no names carved on them. And we know from oral histories that the historian Sam Thomas did at Blackacre decades ago, that a number of people who lived and worked at Blackacre knew where that burial ground was. People like my grandparents and people like me. Why have we forgotten about it and about the people who are buried there? For my book, this past spring, I interviewed Black clergy in Kentucky who fish. I like being around ministers. And I went to Mississippi twice last spring to interview people fishing from shore. Every old person I met in Mississippi sharecropped as a child. Lewis was an 83-year-old man when we met, and he cried when he told me about the racist abuse he suffered in Mississippi when he was a boy. Henry, another older man, told me he'd run away from home in the Mississippi Delta at 11 and lived in an abandoned school bus. He had to eat the fish that he caught just to survive. And just like Clifton 55 years ago, he told me to keep every one of the fish I caught in a bucket that he loaned me so he could take those fish to his neighbors in Vicksburg. Can you imagine what it meant to me to fill up Henry's bucket with fish when decades earlier my bucket for Clifton had been empty? Maria, first woman I met there, told me about her Irish ancestry. An overseer had forced himself on one of her enslaved ancestors, and she and I had Irish middle names that are almost identical. And she said to me warmly, "We might be cousins." Every one of the people I interviewed for my book is descended from slaves, and every one of them is descended from people who look like you and me. Yes, the average black person in America is around 25% white European. We know this from the DNA sites like Ancestry and 23andMe. My white male ancestors very likely had relations, and it's a euphemism for sexual violence, with the black women they owned. I could tell myself the story that my ancestors would never have done such a thing. But that would mean that it's more likely that your ancestors or their ancestors did that kind of thing. And in my world, God calls us to just tell the truth. What our ancestors did in buying, selling, and having relations with human beings was a moral stain on our country. It's that simple. A Louisvillian this past year did remarkable research into the Tyler family's history as enslavers. She had visited Black Acre as a school kid and fell in love with it, just as I still am in love with it. She heard that slaves had worked the land, and she heard this as a child, but she wanted to know more. So she spent 9 months this past year documenting almost everything that's knowable about the Tyler family history as enslavers. In 1860, there were 87 people who were enslaved by the Tyler family at what we call the settlement. About 18 of them were mixed race. And this means that those mixed race people are almost certainly the children of your male ancestors. I almost certainly have black cousins for the same reason. And I would be happy to email you a copy of the report that Rebecca Bernstein did. It's 119 pages. It includes a lot of the names of the Tyler slaves. A lot of people like us who are descended from slave owners don't want to talk about this. We don't even want to hear about it. But I would ask those people this question. Do we have no moral obligation to our black cousins to do better? You and I can't undo what our ancestors did. But I think God calls us to at least name what they did. It's called telling the truth, just as I do in the quiet of my own heart during confession in church. The enslaved offspring of my ancestors lie buried, unnamed, and forgotten somewhere in Virginia. Yours, I humbly submit, might be lying right out in the front field. I'm sure I'm not alone in celebrating the thought that your black cousins might someday be with you at this gathering. After all, they're Tylers too. I hope to finish my book with the consecration, the naming of the sacredness of the slave burial ground that's out in that front field. And if any of you would like to join me in the project, I would love to talk to you. All right, we'll take a deep breath, and I'm sure you have some questions or comments.